First you hear it before you understand it. Not the steady, workmanlike hammer of a Browning, not the clean bark of a rifle. This is a sound that seems to tear its air itself like canvas ripping, like a zipper the size of a house being dragged open. A line of dust leaps from a hedgerow 50 yards ahead, then another, like something invisible is sawing the earth. Men press themselves into the ground because there's nothing else to do. And for a moment, all the training in the world collapses into a single instinct. Stay low, breathe, listen to the storm end. That sound belonged to a new shape of war the Germans had built around steel and doctrine. It was the MG42, a machine gun whose voice could stop a platoon in its tracks, and whose design captured an idea that one weapon in the right hands could command the ground. How did a nation struggling under wartime shortages create a weapon that sounded like the end of hope? And why did it frighten everyone who met it? From the hedgerows of Normandy to the ruins of Cassino to the endless fields of the Eastern Front. To answer, we have to go back to a program with an unromantic name and a radical ambition. In the years after the First World War, German officers replayed their defeat and noticed how much of the battlefield's rhythm had been dictated by machine guns lashed to tripods and stuck in place. When the Reichswehr gave way to the Wehrmacht, planners imagined something different. An Einheitsmaschinengewehr, a universal machine gun that could be light enough to run with the infantry and heavy enough to anchor a defense. It would be one gun, many rolls on a bipod. It would prowl with squads. On a tripod, it would become a long-range instrument. On vehicles, it would be the language of speed. The first real answer was the MG34, beautiful piece of precision engineering, as finely machined as a watch and nearly as sensitive. It could do almost everything the doctrine asked. It could fire from a bipod as a light weapon, lay sustained fire from a complex tripod that let a gunner search an area at range, bolt into tank hulls and cupolas. But beauty has a cost. The MG34 demanded time, skilled labor, and clean conditions. It was expensive to build, slow to produce in the numbers a continental war needed, and fussy in mud and snow. As early battles stretched industry to a breaking point, the Heereswaffen, the Army Ordnance Office, drew a hard line. We need a gun that does what the MG34 does, but built faster, cheaper, with less machine time, and it must work everywhere. The solution would not come from the usual great names. It would come from a factory that made sheet metal parts and tin cans. Johannes Großfuß company in Dublin had no tradition in firearms, but it had something the war now prized above pedigree: mastery of stamped steel. The heavy milling that made the MG34 so fine would be replaced by presses, dies, spot welds, and rivets. The office sent a young engineer, Werner Gruner, to learn machine gun theory from scratch. He studied, sketched, and went back to the presses with a brief. Design a gun around what a factory can do quickly, not what looks elegant on a drafter's table. The prototypes bore awkward names, MG3941sts among them, and ideas from several firms. Nausser and Rheinmetall Borsig tried their hands. Feed mechanisms and locking methods were traded and refined. When the dust of trials settled, the Großfuß pattern stood out. It used a short recoil action and a roller-locked bolt head that snapped in and out of battery with a confidence that felt inevitable. It made use of wide clearances and a fluted chamber that helped stubborn cases slide free, even when mud and ice tried to glue them in place. It was assembled from large pressed shells that fit like armor plates rather than jeweler's parts. The top cover's cam track moved the belt twice on the bolt's way back and forward, doubling feeding speed without punishing the mechanism. It entered service in 1942 with a name as plain as a road sign, MG42. Soldiers met it first as an outline on a hillside and a noise that made language fall away. Its rate of fire, often around 1,200 rounds a minute, sometimes more, meant that a short trigger press laid down a curtain rather than a string. Barrels could be changed in seconds by a side hatch, and a latch one could work with a gloved hand. Belts fed through from drums or boxes and hung close to the receiver, cutting the footprint in a prone position. The tripod, the Lafette 42, was a machine in its own right, buffered, geared, mounted with an optic that allowed a gunner to paint a valley with bullets according to range tables and dials. Germany did not invent fear with this gun. Fear is as old as war. But they gave it a modern voice, and that voice spoke at a speed that felt new. Allied soldiers gave the sound nicknames: the buzzsaw, the zipper. In German hands, it became the center of a squad, the reason for a patrol, the anchor of a defense, the scythe for an ambush. And because the doctrine wrapped itself around the gun took on a life larger than its steel. This story is about engineering under pressure and about doctrine shaping metal into meaning. It is about a weapon designed by a company that had never made one before, scaled by a wartime economy that could not afford artistry, tested in climates that tried to kill machines as surely as men, and carried by crews that learned an odd intimacy with heat and timing and patience. It is also about how fear works, how sound and speed can do a kind of work on the human mind, how myth and reality braid together on a battlefield, and how armies learn to answer a new language of danger. We will take the gun apart in the mind-safe way and lay the parts out on a table. Bolt head and rollers, feed cover and pawls, barrel and booster, the battered bipod and the complicated grace of the Lafette. We will watch crews in white smocks swap a glowing barrel into a snowbank and then back into its steel cradle. We will stand in a workshop where dies slam down on red-hot sheets, and we will be there when a platoon freezes at the edge of a field because the world ahead just turned to noise. And then we will go past fear into the countermeasures, the adaptations, the myths and the truths, and the reasons the MG42's descendants still speak on battlefields long after the men who first fired it are gone. The dream of a universal machine gun promised a new grammar for tactics. In the First World War, machine guns were heavy furniture water-cooled, spiked into the earth, fed by teams of men. Between wars, German officers rebuilt doctrine around speed. Their infantry squads would become a body organized around a single beating heart, the machine gun. Everything else, rifles, grenades, movement, would protect that heart, feed it, and exploit its rhythm. The MG34 looked like the answer. Adopted in the mid-1930s, it was advanced. Air-cooled, quick-change barrel, belt-fed, or magazine-fed, and capable of both slow, precise fire and fast bursts. It could be lifted and moved, or planted on the Lafette tripod to deliver accurate fire at long range. Elevation and traverse controlled by fine hand wheels, and an ingenious device that let the gun automatically sweep a beaten zone. It set a template for what later generations would call the general-purpose machine gun. But time the thing wars burned faster than fuel was the 34's enemy. It took patience and skill to mill its receiver and internal parts. The polish that let its bolt ride like a skater on ice came from hours of cutting and grinding that the factories could not sustain, while also making rifles, tanks, and planes. It did not love dirt. In Russia, mud got in everywhere, and the close tolerances that made it so smooth also made it stop when grit found a home inside. In North Africa, blown sand made its own paste. German ordnance men came back from the front and told the truth armies hate to hear. This is not good enough anymore, not because it does not kill, but because we cannot make enough that will survive where we send it. The Heereswaffenamt had already begun to look for a substitute when the war exploded the timetable. In 1939 and 1940, contracts went out to firms beyond the old circle. The brief seemed almost disrespectful to craft. Stop making art. Make something that can be stamped, spot-welded, folded, and riveted. Replace hours of careful machining with seconds under a press. Design outward from the factory's strengths. The goal was not just a gun that fired fast. It was a gun that could be born fast, in tens of thousands, without begging for the kind of steel and labor that tank plants and fighter lines already consumed. Johan's Großfuß concern brought in Werner Gruner, a young engineer with no romantic ideas about guns at all. He visited schools, read manuals, took apart what he could get, and then applied the discipline of sheet metal work to a violent question. Designers from Mauser and Rheinmetall pursued their own solutions. The trials were practical, not polite. Mud was stirred in. Guns were fired without cleaning on purpose. They were dropped. They were fired until barrels glowed and receivers smoked. Feed jammed? You failed. Parts broke? You went back to the shop. The Großfuß gun was crude in the best sense. Its receiver was two pressed shells mated together, stiffened by ribs that came from dies, not cutters. The bolt head used rollers that canned inward and outward against a wedge to lock and unlock at speed. Compared to rotating bolts that demanded precise timing and perfectly finished lugs, the roller system tolerated filth. The chamber was fluted grooved, so the gas could flow back along the brass, keeping it from sticking when the steel dragged it free. The top cover's heart was a cam path linked to the bolt. As the bolt moved, feed pawls advanced the belt in both directions, turning motion into an economy of speed. The muzzle device, a recoil booster, captured some of the gas to drive the barrel and bolt assembly back with a little more insistence, an adjustable nudge that helped the cycle in cold or dirt. The Army stamped it MG42 in 1942. Field reports began to filter back almost immediately from the Eastern Front, where the first batches went into service. It worked in cold that froze breath to scarves. It ran with a thick paste of mud on its sides. Crews could swap a barrel so fast that a gun could stay in action while the enemy expected silence. It ate ammunition like a hungry animal. Yes, but German doctrine made that the squad's job. Carry belts, bring more, make the gun speak. Cost and time told their own story. The MG34 had consumed a significant slice of skilled labor and machine time. The MG42 took roughly half the hours to produce, with far fewer machined parts and less rare steel. It could be built by a web of subcontractors. Pressed parts stamped in one city, bolts finished in another, receivers spot welded in a third, final assembly in a fourth. Mauser, Gustloff Work, Steyr, and others joined Großfuß to spread production. In a war that was already turning into a contest of factories as much as soldiers, this mattered more than elegance. A weapon that could be made quickly, repaired with simple parts, and taught to cruise in weeks instead of months, was worth more than a perfect instrument that arrived too late or in too few numbers. The doctrine that greeted it was ready. A German infantry. Grupp the squad was an MG squad. The gunner, No. 1, and assistant, No. 2, lived touching the gun. No. 2 carried barrels in a bag and wore a mitten of asbestos and leather to grasp the hot steel. Ammo bearers came behind with belts and drums and boxes. Riflemen worked as a screen, eyes out for threats, rifles pointed at any movement that would disturb the machine's work. On a tripod, the team was larger, the job more technical. The Lafette had buffers to tame recoil and dials that let a trained crew turn numbers into arcs of fire across a map in their heads. An optic perched above the receiver so that a gunner could see without raising his head much at all. A curious device, a kind of cam, could be set so that the gun, under recoil and spring tension, would walk its aim between 2 ranges, an automatic depth fire that swept a trench line like a broom. By the time Allied soldiers met the MG42 in the West, in large numbers, the weapon was no longer a promise. It was a habit. The buzz of its fire told American and British officers not just where the enemy was, but how he thought. To kill the gun, you had to kill the team. And to kill the team, you had to fight an entire squad whose purpose was to keep that team alive. And yet, as fear grew around the sound, so did the countermeasures. Armies are conservative until an enemy forces them to become imaginative. The MG42's very efficiency would push its enemies to change. Before that, there were the inevitable myths and truths bleeding into each other. Some said it could cut a man in half. No machine gun needs to do that to make a mind fill with dread. Others counted the bullets and realized a different logic. A very fast gun creates short, dense bursts that let a good gunner write a line in air that a man cannot run through. The truth sat there, humming regardless. The MG42 was not magic. It was a tool designed around the battlefield Germany wanted. It would do what it promised, as long as the men carrying belts could get to it in time, and as long as the barrels got a rest. Its danger was as much about the crew and the doctrine as it was about steel. Lay the MG42 out on a bench. On the left, a barrel slender compared to the impression it made in memory. It is a simple tube with a careful sole, cut from steel chosen for heat and pressure. Each barrel has a story measured in meters of steel cut and minutes of heat. Too fast on the trigger, and its throat erodes. Too slow on the change, and heat blooms into damage. In service, crews were taught a rhythm about 250 rounds, and then swap under sustained fire, more or less depending on winter's kindness and how urgent the day's math felt. A bag with spare barrels hangs from a No. 2's shoulder like a promise. Next, the bolt head and its rollers a wedge of steel and 2 hardened cylinders that pop outward into shallow recesses in the barrel extension when the gun fires and snaps them back when the short recoil and an internal cam make their geometry turn. It is a clever answer to a hard problem. Lock fast, unlock faster, do it with parts that can be made with presses and grinders rather than lathes alone. Add a stout return spring and a guide rod, a firing pin that lives in motion rather than waiting hot in a closed chamber, because this is an open bolt gun in automatic fire, safer in the heat since a round does not sit cooking while a gunner thinks. Pick up the receiver. Not a single forged block machined to lines, but 2 pressed shells married along their spine and belly. Ribs stiffen at corrugations, born in seconds under a die that whispers, cost savings like a ledger clerk. The top cover is a busy brain. Open it, and you see the feed pawls and the cam track tied to a spring arm. When the bolt goes back, the belt advances. When it goes forward, it advances again. This two-step feed is one of the secrets of speed without brutality. The belt itself is a chain of steel links that don't fall to the ground, non-disintegrating, reusable, snapped together in lengths, coiled into a drum for mobile work, or pulled from a can for a gun that is settled into a position that may hold until dark. At the muzzle, a recoil booster, a little rocket scientist wearing a simple coat. Gas pressure against a cup pushes the barrel assembly back a little harder than recoil alone would. Swap the cup or its aperture, and you change the gun's cadence. Add a heavier bolt, and your rate drops a touch. Lighten it, and the voice rises toward that mythic buzz. A conical flash hider throws fire forward and away from a gunner's eyes. And at night, it draws a line no one wants to be on the receiving end of. Under the receiver, a bipod that knows rocks and roots, and a pin that lets the barrel jacket swing open to the side. Press the latch, tilt, and the barrel comes free with a metallic sigh. A gloved hand-asbest hand shoe, ugly but necessary, grabs the hot steel and drops it into the snow, steam rising like a ghost. Another goes in, the latch closes, the cover drops, the feed is checked with a practiced push-pull, and the storm begins again. And there in the corner, the MG42, a tripod that is part furniture, part instrument. A front leg planted, the rear leg splayed, the cradle holding the gun like an embrace made of tubes and springs. A buffered recoil system tames the bucking energy, keeping the sight picture stable for a gunner who peers through a small optic with a mild magnification. The clamps and micrometers translate windage and elevation into clicks and confidence. On the right side, a box of range tables and a calculator's mind. The gunner sets lines and arcs, dials and distance, and with a device that nudges the cradle under recoil, the gun searches in depth, shooting a little short, a little long, back and forth, a machine doing what a disciplined man would do if he had the patience of a clock. With the tripod, the MG42 becomes a different animal. Not just a sprinter laying down a terrifying burst, but a crew-served heavyweight, reaching with authority out to where eyes strain. All of this runs on 7.9 257mm Mauser cartridges, full-power rifle rounds, with a reputation carved across 2 world wars. The MG42's fluted chamber, those tiny grooves cut lengthwise, serve a purpose invisible to a casual eye. When the round fires, a mist of gas leaks around the brass, breaking suction, easing extraction at high speed, when heat makes metal try to expand and cling. This is not indulgence. It is survival at 1,200 rounds a minute. What does such a machine give a squad? Momentum. German infantry tactics wrapped themselves around the gun. In the attack, the Grupp's MG went to ground where it could see the objective. It began to speak in bursts, while riflemen shifted left or right to find an angle. In defense, the gun was everything. Sighted to cover avenues of approach, with overlapping arcs that made a fan of death. Ammo bearers were as important as anyone with a trigger. The no, two's rhythm fresh belt in, old belt out, link by link checked, barrel swapped, was the drum track the whole fight followed. There were costs. A high rate of fire is a bargain with physics. More bullets, more heat, faster. A careless gunner could burn a barrel, cook off a round, or batter parts into an early retirement. The ammo appetite meant belts had to move forward like blood to a wound. A gun team out on a limb without resupply was a king without a court impressive for a minute and then in trouble. And on a bipod, while short bursts stitched a tight line, long bursts made the muzzle climb. Discipline mattered more than bravado. The fear the gun inspired had roots in fact and branches in psychology. A short press that put 20 rounds through a gap in a hedge sounded like possibility collapsing. A man dashing across a road had to pass through a wall, not a fence. His chances shrank. The distinctive ripping sound confused new troops, who could not count shots or judge distance by tempo. Yet armies adapted. Allied training films deconstructed the myth. Yes, the German gun fires faster. No, it is not magic. Here is how you beat it. Smoke it, pin it with your own fire. Use mortar to disturb the crew. Flank when its head is down. Cut the belts with artillery fragments by chance and will. And treat the gun as a system whose nerves you can attack. Even so, soldiers are allowed to believe in monsters because it helps them respect danger. The MG42 became a character in the war's dark theater. Nicknames stuck because they captured something beyond numbers. The buzz, the feeling in the gut that you were being written into a ledger you could not see. And yet, for the men behind it, the gun was a daily craft. Grease in winter, sand brushed out with fingers, pawls checked, springs swapped, a spare firing pin in a pocket. It was a job as much as a legend, and crews prided themselves on keeping a savage instrument civilized. Production told another, quieter story. The MG42 taught a generation of industrialists what designs could be built at speed with stamped parts, hence welded seams without sacrificing function. Plants in Germany and occupied territories cut, pressed, and finished components in a cascade. Gauges checked holes and edges. Heat treatment took brittle to tough. Phosphating and bluing protected surfaces. It was not artisanry. It was a choreography of presses, jigs, and hands. The trick was designing a gun that forgave a little variation, a stamped receiver flexes, and so the gun was designed to accept that, to run with parts that were close enough to spec, because the dies had done most of the precision for them. By late 1943, hundreds of thousands of MG34s and MG42s together formed a web of fire across fronts. The 34s often stayed in vehicles and in roles that prized semi-automatic single shots or closed bolt control. The 42s, kings of the open field and the ruined street, went wherever infantry needed authority in a hurry. The two guns stood side by side in photos and in units, a pair that explained Germany's talent and its predicament, a beautiful pre-war idea and its wartime successor, together trying to make a doctrine hold against a world turning against them. Meet it on the battlefield. In the summer of 1943, near a place called Kursk, the MG42's voice joined the roar of engines and the whine of shells in a battle, so big that historians still struggle to hold it all in one mental frame. Soviet infantry learned quickly what German squads had already practiced. When the gun speaks, the ground becomes a map of small possibilities. A dash between shell holes was measured in heartbeats and bursts. Soviet doctrine answered with weight mortar rolling forward, Maxims chattering in reply, the first of a generation of simpler, rugged light machine guns that would mature into the PK family after the war. But that summer, The MG42 gave German squads the ability to pin down attackers long enough for counterattacks to gather their own speed. In Italy, around a monastery that turned into a world of stone and dust-mounted casino, the sound of the MG42 ricocheted from walls like a bad memory. British and Polish troops advancing through fields crisscrossed by dry stone walls found that the gun's high rate suited short lines of sight. A half-second press put offensive lead between two gaps. Crossing was a kind of lottery with poor odds. The answer was as old as infantry: fire and movement. Brenns on one wall would trade with 42s on another, while a section crept around a flank. Piat teams crawled in close. Mortar plopped. Smoke shells bloomed, ate the light, bought seconds. The myth of invincibility thinned each time a team with a rocket, a grenade, or a bayonet reached the flank and ended the conversation with violence up close. In Normandy, the buzz became part of the hedgerow's thick air. American squads, built around the rifle more than a single machine gun, had to relearn. The bar was a fine weapon, accurate, reliable, but one man with a 20-round magazine could not speak the same language as a belt fed with a crew. Company-level M1919s filled in, but mobility suffered in the hedges. Tactics shifted, often in the space of a day. A platoon would meet an MG42, sighted behind a gap, invisible, its tracers crossing a field already measured that morning. The lieutenant, face in the dirt, would shout for smoke. The mortar team would lay a veil between this hedge and that one. The bar would snap, and the garons would clap a fast cadence. A tank would edge up to punch a hole in the wall of green with coax and a 75. It is one thing to tell a man, "Don't fear the noise, fear the bullets." It is another to ask him to stand up into both. Allied training caught up. Films played in tents and quonsets, explaining the German gun with a strange combination of respect and reassurance. The enemy gun fires faster, they said. That means it fires in dense bursts. Keep your head and count your time. They taught soldiers to hear the difference between a long, uncontrolled sweep and a professional staccato, to wait for a pause during a barrel change, to push in that space. They taught gunners to lay smoke on the muzzle flash rather than the noise, which echoes. They emphasized that the gun is a crew kill the no-to and belts tangle. Wound the gunner and the rhythm stutters. In the field, infantry learned to call the artillery not just on trenches, but on the space behind the gun where ammo bearers ran. Break the supply, and a fearsome weapon becomes a dead weight. The MG42 also met its own limits. In cities, rubble could be friend or enemy. A high rate of fire meant ammunition evaporated. Belts ran out on stairwells. In long defenses, barrels cracked when discipline failed or when necessity vetoed doctrine, and men held the triggers because to stop was to invite a rush. In the East, winter could bite past engineering. Springs broke in the cold. Firing pins snapped. Crews warmed parts under coats and with coarse language. Still, when compared to its peers, the 42 kept going. In conditions that left other designs sulking, it rattled on with an ugly cheerfulness. Listen to soldiers. A British private at Caen described the MG42 sound as someone tearing the whole world open. An American sergeant in the Hurtgen said it made men feel like someone was drawing a line on your skin and waiting to press. A Soviet platoon commander on the Dnieper called it a metronome of fear, and then shrugged, and then we learned when the metronome pauses. Hyperbole shares a bunk with honesty at the front. Veterans will tell you with a laugh that nothing is as bad as it seems, and with a quiet that some things are worse. There were tactical theaters where the MG42 was the law for hours. A German outpost in a copse of trees on a slope could hold a battalion's advance until armor and heavy weapons could be brought up. Defensive lines bristled with interlocking arcs that made every approach a geometry problem. The Lafette tripod made the difference often at dusk, when visibility dropped and a gun with an optic and range table could continue to paint a field while attackers felt their way forward blind. Armored crews had their own view. Inside cramped turrets, most German vehicles kept the older MG34 with an armored barrel sleeve, the Panzerlauf, because it offered closed-bolt semi-auto control and a trigger feel that worked better through linkages and tight spaces. The MG42, always open bolt and automatic fire, and lacking a true semi-auto mode in most infantry configurations, stayed mostly with the men on foot, where its virtues ruled. On half-tracks rolling down dust-choked lanes, both guns appeared, the 42 barking over a tailgate, Spitfire in human hands. Allies answered with material as well as method. More M1919s were pushed down to platoons. British units prized their Brens for their accuracy and ease in rough ground, paired with PIATs and 2-inch mortar to move a firefight center. American squads leaned into the advantage of semi-automatic rifles. If you cannot match the 42's belt, you can at least drown a position and aim shots from 10 Garands while your heavy weapons get into play. Mortar, the quiet geniuses of infantry, became the valued friend. A few rounds of high explosive and smoke dropped a curtain, and when the curtain lifted, there was either a rush or nothing at all. In the end, what terrified everyone was not a technical detail, but an experience. The MG42 took the moment of stepping into an open space and made it feel like stepping into a machine. It made a man imagine the line of his own life drawn in front of him in tracers. That was its power. And when soldiers found ways to move anyway, to crawl, sprint, throw smoke, yell, laugh, and curse at the noise and then go forward, they found a way to make fear into fuel. The German gun wrote its harsh music. The Allies learned to dance through it at a cost the casualty lists still carry. When the war ended, the MG42's echoes kept working in mines and factories. The idea of a single machine gun that could live on a bipod, a tripod, and a vehicle stuck. In Belgium and France, engineers examined captured guns and then went to their own drawing boards. In Herstal, the FN team blended German concepts with their own to create the Mag-A gun that would serve under dozens of flags, belt-fed, quick barrel, stout and sure. A cousin that learned from the 42 without merely copying it. In West Germany, the Bundeswehr simply kept the bloodline alive, converting the gun to 7.62 times 51 NATO. They called it the MG1 and later the MG3, with bolt weights and boosters to tune the rate, with modern belts, with the same silhouette that old men recognized with a complicated squint. In Yugoslavia, factories turned out the M53 and near-literal MG42 flickering again in Balkan light. In Italy, the MG42 59ths served in updated form. In Spain, the CETMEMLE took the logic of stamped receivers and a roller-locked bolt in a lighter package for a different role. In Switzerland, a more machined, meticulous cousin, the MG51, showed how another culture weighted the balance between cost and precision. Doctrine shifted around the world. The gun-centric squad became a common language. Soviet designers went their own way for a time-pan-fed light guns in wartime. Then the SG-43 and later the PK series, the Kalashnikov's team created a general-purpose machine gun that carried a clear family resemblance to German ideas filtered through Soviet practice. Belt-fed, quick-change, reliable on bipod and tripod everywhere. NATO units standardized on belt-fed 7.62 seconds for the base of fire and lighter 5.56 squad guns for movement. The point had been made. One good gun, fed and crewed, could redraw a small map. The MG42's legend stayed tangled with its facts. Veterans told stories they had earned the right to tell any way they liked. The leather glove sizzling on a barrel became a kind of talisman in memory. The ripping noise recorded in training films and newsreels lived on in cinema, often exaggerating the rate until it became a caricature of dread. Technical histories corrected details. No, it did not cut men in half. Yes, it fired so fast that individual reports blurred. Yes, it was accurate enough to do serious work at range when mounted and properly sighted. No, it was not a gift from a single genius, but from a marriage between a doctrine, a need, and a kind of factory. There is a moral awkwardness in admiring the engineering of a weapon. The MG42 served a brutal cause, and its fear fed a war that ground up cities and families. But to understand is not to praise. To study how it came to be is to study how ideas move through societies under stress, how a bureaucracy can invite an outsider, the tin can factory, to solve a problem the old ferns could not. How a specification that seems cold can produce an object that reshapes human behavior. How sound itself becomes strategy. The gun terrified because it made a certain human calculation appear instantly. This space is not yours. It is ours. That is what all weapons tried to say. The MG42 said it with an accent no one had heard before. There are tender endings even here. Stand at a range on a cold morning and watch an old man in his 80s lift his hand at the first rip of a modern MG3 and then shake his head, eyes wet not from fear, but from remembering boys who did not get to grow old. Walk through a museum and see a spare barrel bag and the ugly glove. Imagine the assistant gunner's pride in a good, fast change. Read an Allied sergeant's letter home, where he jokes about the zip gun, and then, a paragraph later, asks his brother to send a photograph of the kitchen. Between these artifacts and sentences lives the truth of the MG42. Not just a machine, but a presence. As a piece of industrial history, it is a lesson in designing for manufacture. The pivot from machine to stamped, from artisan to assembly line, did not make the gun worse. It made it better for its purpose and survivable under pressure. The fluted chamber, the roller lock, the two-stroke feed each is a reminder that elegant solutions can be born in the constraints of time and material, not despite them. Every modern factory that swings a press over a functional shape owes a nod, however slight, to the blunt intelligence that brought this gun into being. As a military story, it is a reminder that doctrine writes itself into metal. Germany imagined a squad with a machine heart and built the heart to fit the dream. The Allies imagined many hands and many rifles co-equal. And when they met the German idea, they bent and adapted, stacked machine guns at lower levels, changed how they moved. When we read casualty lists from Normandy and Cassino, from Kharkov and the Vosges, we see the cost of these ideas clashing. If we choose not to forget, it is because forgetting makes us helpless the next time an idea turns into a shape that changes how humans meet. As for fear, the MG42 teaches that terror can be mechanical and that courage can be mundane. The men who faced it learned to move under its voice. The men who fired it learned to keep it alive when the cold wanted it dead. In that exchange is the small, stubborn miracle of soldiers everywhere. To feel something ancient in your gut when the zipper starts to rip, and then to do your job anyway. If there is a call embedded in this history, it is to look hard at the things we inherit machines, doctrines, myths, and to choose our response with open eyes. Admire the cleverness if you must. Honor the dead always. Beware the seduction of sound and spectacle that can make a weapon seem larger than the people it harms or the decisions that unleash it. And when you hear in an old film or a modern news clip that rip in the air, remember both sides of its story. The engineer with a stamp press trying to solve a problem, and the private on the edge of a field chest against the earth, counting the heartbeats between bursts, waiting for the moment to lift his head and run.